We can draw buildings that are very accurate in many ways, but that's not the same thing as drawing them so that they look realistic. In this video, I talk through a drawing of this public toilet, in fact, in the grounds of a royal palace in Paris, just on the outskirts of Paris. And I explain 3 tips of ways I think when I draw, which I think are important in creating a realistic effect in my buildings, in how they look. I hope you like it. The first tip in drawing more realistic looking buildings is to get the perspective right. Nothing makes a building look less real than if its lines are in a way which is physically impossible for it to be in real life. And we need to realize that this isn't as obvious as we think, which is why it's such a problem. And I know it is very helpful to understand perspective and perspective theory and to see all those diagrams and understand how they work with vanishing points and horizons and all of that. But in practice, we don't usually have room on our paper anyway to draw our perspective lines to vanishing points. So we need to learn to see the perspective lines and to put them on our paper accurately. One way I found, as I'm showing here in this drawing, is to use my pen as an angle measurer. I find it works very well. I just put it on the angle on the paper and then slide it across onto the paper that I'm drawing on. It works just as well in real life. You hold it up in front of you at the angle of whatever building you're looking at, and then just bring it straight down onto the paper to check that angle. It's surprisingly accurate. And what it tells me is that I consistently underestimate the angle. There is something in my brain which loses some of the extremeness of the angle between looking at it and putting my pen on paper. So by measuring in this way, it's a huge help for me. Even after all these drawings, it's a huge help for me to get the angle correct. And the most important lines are the top angle and the bottom angle. So it's usually a roof line angle on the top, and it may be the ground level, or it may be some sort of mark on the building at ground level. But whichever way, take particular care to get those angles exact, because then we know that all the angles in between have to fan out evenly, so to speak. And so it's easier then to tell if one of those perspective lines between these 2 extreme lines is correct. And that's what I'm doing here. And of course, the perspective lines have to be measured in a 2-point perspective drawing, as is the case here, in both directions. My second tip for drawing more realistic buildings, and look, this one's going to seem a bit strange, and you probably haven't heard it and won't hear it anywhere else, but this comes from my experience and my technique with my drawing. So look, it may not work for everyone, but my second tip is this: try to avoid using single lines too often to define an edge. Now, it is my drawing technique that I seem to draw a lot of lines, and I draw lines over the top of each other, sometimes because I don't think it's heavy enough, the first line, or I don't think the angle's quite correct, so I want to draw it more correctly. But for whatever reason, I draw multiple lines in most places, and I feel that creates a more lifelike look to that edge, because in practice, when we look at a building, even the corners of a building, or the corners of the roof lines, or the corners of the gutters, even the corner of the window frames, they actually have a thickness. It might only be a couple of millimeters, but the edges actually have a thickness that is not an absolute point in the way that, say, a polished metal cube would be. And so sometimes the edges are very sharp, and a single line is the best way to represent that. But with most architecture, the corners still actually have a thickness to them. And so to capture this, particularly in the edges that are closest to the viewer, I think adds a degree of realism to the drawing. So that's my second tip, to use multiple edges. So that's my second tip, to use multiple lines for edges and corners. And also, of course, to create a three-dimensional effect on our surfaces by drawing the depth lines. And this second point ties in with that. We often simply don't have enough lines on the paper to create a three-dimensional feel. So make sure we do that. Make sure we create a nice three-dimensional feel by putting lines to represent depth in whatever angles our viewpoint gives us depth. Usually it's 2 in a 2-point perspective drawing. One of the sides and either the upper edges or the lower edges have some observable depth in them. So we need to make sure we capture those if we want the buildings to look real. And my third tip for making buildings look realistic is this. My third tip in how our drawings of buildings can be more realistic is to do with the surface texture of the building. Now, in some buildings this may be minimal, but in many buildings we can see things such as stonework or bricks or tiles. And so creating the effect of those creating the effect of those elements is important in creating a realistic look. But they're usually very complex and very detailed. So knowing how to do that, knowing in fact where we stop drawing bricks or do we draw every brick is important. Because I feel that in most drawings where every brick is drawn, it ends up making it look less real rather than more real. Because when we look at a building, we actually don't see every brick. We see some bricks in certain places, but our mind just kind of knows that there's bricks in all the parts that we're not really looking at. And I think a drawing usually looks more realistic if we imitate that effect by just drawing some of the bricks. And of course, the important thing in drawing bricks is to get the scale correct. If our bricks are too large, it may make our building look too small. If our bricks are too small, it may make our building look larger than it really is. It's the same effect with the leaves on a tree. So we have to make sure that we get the scale right when we start to draw these elements. It's a similar situation with the tiles on a roof. Now, in this building, the tiles are very flat, and so we're really just concerned with showing some lines to indicate the rows of tiles going up the roof and then some individual tiles edges. And with these edges between the tiles, it's important that we reflect the perspective angles that they take on the ceiling, or else they won't sit flat and it will be a disruptive visual effect, not a helpful one. Anything we get wrong basically makes our drawing of our building look less realistic. And then there's shadow, which is part of the surface texture. Now, hatching is another subject, and it's a very personal technique in a way, how an artist hatches. I like to reflect the shape of the object underneath the shadow. So in this case, it's a straight line, the flatness of the wall. So I like to have straight lines for my hatching in those cases, as I do here. But they're still pretty loose. They're not exact. But I find the important thing is not to let them look like scribble. Of course, drawing buildings to look realistic isn't the only way we can draw buildings, and many artists whose work I really like have a deliberate and quite particular way of distorting the lines of the architecture that they draw. That's incredibly effective and arresting. But if we want to draw things that look realistic, these are some of the tips that I've found with my own work that has helped me to achieve this. Of course, everything has to be adapted to how you draw and to the effect that you want to create with your drawings. But I hope some of these at least are helpful and give some direction if you're still trying to find your own particular style and approach. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you're wanting to try and make your drawings of buildings look more realistic, then I hope that's given you some things that you can think about and can practice. The important thing is to keep having fun when you draw. I'll see you next time. Bye.